Hey, we're excited for this morning, excited for all of you guys to be here as we kick off this brand new series. And so let me ask you a question as we get started this morning. How many of you guys have ever had a really bad day, right? How many of you ever had a really bad day? How many, maybe you don't have to necessarily raise your hand, but how many of us have had a bad month? Or maybe we've had a bad season. Maybe we've had a bad year, right? All of us go through bad days and through bad seasons. Some of our bad days are just incredibly annoying because we got a flat tire, we spilled our coffee, maybe we had a kid throw up all over the bathroom and we had to clean that up. Maybe there's some other things that have happened in our lives that have just made it like the worst day ever. Years ago, this is a pretty old story for me, but years ago I was traveling from Orlando back to Lakeland, and I was on I-4 and I'm driving back. This is even before Kim and I met, so this is a long time ago. And I'm traveling back from Orlando and I get a flat tire. And I had this small little car at the time, and so I get out, pull over on the side of I-4, and I jack the car up and I loosen the lug nuts and then jack it up and go to take the tire off. And as I go to take the tire off, literally the jack gives and the car just falls, like on top of the tire. And so I'm like, now what am I supposed to do? I don't know what I'm going to do. So anyways, we're able to somehow get the jack out and find another place and get it jacked up. And I finally get the tire off, and it's this huge, crazy situation. And I'm just mad and I'm frustrated. And this was before Jesus in my life. And so I'm saying all kinds of choice words and all kinds of fun stuff on the side of I-4. And I just get so mad. And I grab the tire and I just go, oh! And I just throw the tire flat down. Like just slam it down to the ground. And the tire bounces up. It's flat. I don't know how this happened. Bounces up and starts rolling across I-4. And I'm like right by the SeaWorld exit. And I'm standing on the side of the road watching this tire roll across I-4 going, dear Lord, I'm going to cause an 8-car pileup. And I'll never have car insurance again the rest of my life. And I'm watching this tire roll across. And luckily, somehow, thank you God, nobody hit it. Nobody had to slam on brakes. It rolls across, hits the overpass, or the wall for the overpass, jumps over it, and just disappears into oblivion. I put the donut on and left. Like, I'll buy a rim somewhere else. So I'm good. Right? And so it can have a bad day. But sometimes our bad days turn to are more serious. And sometimes our bad days are more tragic. We get the news of something heart-wrenching. We find out that we've lost someone that we love dearly. In the last couple weeks, there's been some tragedy that has happened in some youth groups at a couple of churches. One here in Lakeland, Fuel Church, that sent us out and planted us, as well as a youth group in Tampa that they had. Fuel had 2 free students that were in a car traveling in the Dade City area. Horrific accident. You may have seen it on the news or in the paper. One of the girls was ejected from the car and ended up passing away. She was 15 years old. The other 2, the driver was a girl who was in our youth group when Kim and I were there. She's finally getting out of recovery, which is a miracle in itself. And then there was this youth group in Tampa that were on their way back from a trip, I believe, and something happened with a tire on the van. And they either blew a tire or the tire fell off. I don't know the exact detail, but the van ended up rolling and the student ended up losing their life in this tragedy, like they had just come back from a trip. And so sometimes it's a bad day, like a tire rolling across the road, and sometimes it's this tragic turn to what's happening in our lives, and this tragic turn when we get this bad news. But as I said at the very beginning, I believe that sometimes our bad days can be God's best moments. And how do we navigate that? And how do we use that? And how do we allow God to use us in that? Earlier this week, I posted on Facebook, hey, tell us about some of your bad days. And a couple of you guys said there's just too many of them. A couple of you, my aunt is one that responded, and she said, living it right now. My uncle has had cancer for a long time and has gone through chemotherapy and has done all the treatments, and he got a report about 2 months ago that he was all clear and everything was good to go. Then he went back for a follow-up scan and he noticed something and had to send it back, and now the cancer is back again. So when she responds and says, living it right now, they're walking through what are bad days and some tragic times. And so whether it's annoying or whether it's tragic that we all experience these bad days, we all have these moments and we all have these tough seasons in life. But what I love so much about the scriptures and the story that we're actually going to be in, the same story for 4 weeks, looking at different aspects of the story, is that a bad day wasn't a surprise for Jesus at all. That in John chapter 16, you don't have to turn there, it'll be on the screens, but in John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus told us this. He says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. That in the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus tells us in John 16:33 that we're going to have bad days. That tribulation is going to come. That trouble is going to, but we don't have to worry because He's overcome the world. And so following Jesus doesn't mean that we won't have bad days. Following Jesus with our lives doesn't mean that we won't have bad days, but it does mean that we have Him to go through the bad days. Don't miss that. That following Jesus doesn't say that we're not going to have bad days. It just tells us that we have Him when we're going through the bad days. And so this morning, as we get ready to dive into this series and look at the story that some of you will be familiar of and some of you may have never heard this story before. It comes to the story that comes from us or comes from the scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 15. It's a story in the life of a guy, a day in the life, I should say, of King David. Maybe he's someone that you're familiar with. Many of us know him as David that took on Goliath. Well, later he became the king of Israel. And it's a story that takes place in the day in the life of King David. And each week of the series, we're going to look at this one particular day and take some truths about how to handle life's toughest moments. Those worst day evers. And so now I know that we've all had some bad days, but on this particular day, I just want to try to set up the story for you a little bit. Is that David and his son Absalom. Absalom has decided that he wants to be king more than his dad, and so Absalom has decided that he's going to throw this coup or throw this thing. Absalom is going after David. Absalom is going after David. And he decides that he's going to throw this coup. He decides that he's going to have this idea that he wants to be king. And so he plots and plans and finds this idea that he's going to kill his son or kill his father David. Now, I don't know about you and I don't know about your worst day ever, but I've never had a day so bad that one of my children wanted to kill me, right? At least not that I know of, right? At least that they haven't told me. And so that's a pretty bad day. I mean, I'm sure some days the thought has crossed their mind, but that's a pretty bad day. And how does this look? How are we going to navigate this, or how does David have that? But before we get into the full story of David and of Absalom, let's look at it this way. That sometimes we think that bad things can happen to bad people, or that sometimes bad things happen to bad people. That we have this tendency, and I think I've been guilty of it early in my walk with Christ, where I believe that God punishes bad people for doing bad things so that they won't be bad anymore. You know plenty of people that may have believed this way. I've had friends that have believed this way. Well, they got a flat tire because of this, or this happened to them because of this, or this happened to them because of that. And we paint this picture that sometimes we believe that bad things happen to bad people so that they won't be bad people. But there's times I believe that God uses circumstances and certain things to get our attention. But the one thing that we got to know and we got to understand about God is that God isn't a revengeful God. He isn't a God that looks at you and says, man, you messed up today, so I'm going to get you back. God is a God of discipline. He disciplines us like a good father would. But He's not revengeful. My kids mess up. I don't take revenge on my kids. I discipline them because I know that there's a better future for them. That there's something that God wants for them. And I want them to act a certain way and behave a certain way and do a certain way. But I'm not taking revenge on my children. I'm just trying to help them reach a better future and a better future destination that they have. So, in the scriptures, God describes David as a man after His own heart. That God says and describes David that you are a man, that he is a man after His own heart. That in other words, David is close to God. But what I love so much about David, and what many of you may love so much about David, is that David wrote books in the Bible. And David wrote books in the Bible, but he still had awful days. He still had family trouble. He still had health issues. He still had tragedy. And he still had pain, just like you and just like me. And in this idea of what it looks like for us to follow after God and to seek after God, even in our worst day ever, is that we got to know, we've got to understand that it's important that we are following Jesus, because that He is our hope in the middle of trouble. He's not some bubble that we can live in, which means that trouble will never get to us and that trouble will never come, but that Jesus is our hope in the middle of trouble. Your circumstances don't prove your faith. Your circumstances don't prove your faith, they reveal your faith. That so often in our lives we think about the things that are around us, or we think, man, if things are good, then God must be happy with me, and if things are bad, then God must be unhappy with me. And our circumstances don't prove our faith, they reveal our faith. That in the tough times, are we seeking after God? And in the tough times, is our faith stronger or is it weaker in the tough times? Because so often, however our day goes, whichever way the ocean moves us, whichever way the waves come, whatever it looks like, depends on whether we're having a good day or a bad day. And it just changes our faith journey. So many people go through struggles in life and they pull away from God and they pull away from church and they pull away from all these things. Well, my life is just a mess right now and God must be upset with me and God must be mad at me, or I just don't have faith right now. And so they just pull away. When what we should do is push in. What we should do is push into God. What we should do is be in church more. We should have people around us, which is the church, that loves us. But so often, man, our lives get crazy and things get busy and turmoil comes and we just start to pull away from our faith and pull away from church, when what we should do is push in. And so our circumstances don't prove our faith, but they reveal our faith. So as we kick off this series today, talking about the worst day ever, this first week we're going to look at this idea of bad news, because bad days usually involve bad news. And so if you have your Bibles today, I want you to turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 15, and we're going to look at the story of Absalom and David. And as you're turning there, I've already kind of set up some of the story for you, but in the first 5 verses, it tells us that Absalom, who is David's oldest son, is standing out by the city gates. And as people walk by, working their way towards the king so that he can resolve judgments and the king can do what the king is supposed to do, Absalom was like, hey, don't worry about it. The king's really busy. I can take care of that for you. Hey, don't worry about the king. Like, man, if you need something taken care of, I'm your man. Like, I can do it. He's kind of putting himself up on a pedestal. He's politicalizing himself in a way to say, hey man, I'm the guy. Like if you need something done, I'm the man. The king can't do it. He's too busy. I got you. And he's setting this idea up where the people are beginning to come to him instead of going to the king like they're supposed to. And we're going to pick up in verse 6. And it says, thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord. And hold on. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying that if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord. And then the king said to him, Go in peace. So he arose and he went to Hebron, but Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of a trumpet, then say Absalom is king at Hebron. And when Absalom went, 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went there in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor from the city of Gilad, and the conspiracy grew strong. And the people with Absalom kept increasing. And a messenger came to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. And then David said to all of his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said to the king, Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides. So in this story, as we begin to see this, David is at the beginning of what I believe is probably one of his worst days ever. In the matter of seconds, his life is turned upside down based on one piece of information. That Absalom is sitting outside the city gates for a long time, moving the people and winning the hearts and turning the hearts of the people away from David to him. And he goes to David and says, Hey, grant me passage to leave and to go. And as he's going, he invites some people from Jerusalem. It tells us in the scriptures that he only invited 200 people. That they didn't even know why they were going. That they said that they were going in their innocence. They didn't even know what Absalom wanted from them, but they just decided to go. But the information gets back to David that the entire city of Jerusalem is turned on him. That one piece of information turns David's world upside down and sends David into scramble mode and sends David into trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? My oldest son is trying to kill me. What am I going to do? We've got to flee for our lives. David's whole life is turned upside down by one piece of information. That he's got to get out of town as fast as he possibly can, or he's going to be killed. Now, how many of you know that that's a bad day? When your oldest son is turning what you think is the entire city around you, and if you don't leave and get out of town, then you're going to die. But it's amazing to me and how crazy, how quickly everything can get turned upside down by one piece of information. One phone call, one text message, one Facebook message, one Facebook post, a quick meeting when your boss says, Hey, will you step into my office for just a moment? That in our lives, one moment and one thing, one quick moment can change our lives forever in the same way that David's life was changed here. And that's exactly what's happening to David in this. But I believe that sometimes we feel like God is this type A personality. That he's driven by plans and he's driven by schedules to keep. And so often in the midst of our bad days, it's not okay for us to mourn. It's not okay for us to cry. It's not okay for us to feel discouraged, because that shows a sign of weakness. If you've ever read through the book of Psalms, David shows lots of mourning, lots of crying, lots of weakness, but God said he was a man after my own heart. Because so often we feel like, man, that we've got friends around us when everything in our world seems to be falling apart, and their response to us is just suck it up, man. Just suck it up. Get over it. It's going to be all right. Just suck it up. Just move on. Get over it. But when you are in the midst of what seems to be the worst day ever, and you are emotionally paralyzed by that sometimes we feel like, I believe that we can feel like God is disappointed in us in some way. Because we're upset, or because we can't keep it together. But that's exactly the opposite. 2 verses for you. You can go back and read them later. But Psalms 56:8 says, You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? I mean, you have kept You have kept a record of all the tribulations and all the troubles and all the hard times that I've had and all the things that I've gone through, and you've captured all of my tears in a bottle. Are they not in your book? And Psalm 34:18 tells us that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and He saves the crushed in spirit. So that no matter how mentally strong or how emotionally strong you are at some point in your life, there are going to be moments where your spirits are going to be crushed. They are. And when that moment comes, I want you to know as we start out this series that Jesus isn't disappointed in you. Jesus isn't frustrated with you. Jesus isn't shaking His head at you going, oh man, what is wrong with them? This is just an opportunity for you to draw closer to Him. That in our brokenness, He wants us to come to you. God isn't sitting in heaven shaking His head and embarrassed about your tears or embarrassed about your emotional breakdown. As a parent, one of our kids falls down and scrapes their knee, or they fall off a bicycle, or they bump their head, or they hurt themselves, or they slam their finger in a door. And so often, especially when they're smaller, you just have to kind of hold on to them and comfort them until they feel like they're at a level where they're good and they're over it, and then they want out of your arms and off they go. But in the same way, when we're going through bad times and we're having worst day evers and all these things are happening in our life, I believe God just wants to hold on to us the same way. That He wants to hold on to us the same way. Because one of the best things about being a parent, even when your kids are sick, it's the one time that they just want to be as close to you as they possibly can. It's the one time that they want to cuddle up. It's the one time that they want to kind of fall asleep in your lap. It's the one time that they're with you. That often they're like, I'm too busy or I'm running, no matter how big, busy, or how small I should say they are. That when they're sick, they just want their parents. In the same way that when we're brokenhearted and when we're hurting and when we're there, God wants to be there like that to hold on to us. And when we look at this story with David and Absalom, let's look at verses 10 and 11. Verses 10 and 11. It says, but Absalom sent some secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at the throne. And when Absalom went, 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. So recapping this portion of the story, 200 men who didn't know where they were going and why they were going show up in Absalom's presence, and the news reaches David that the whole country is on Absalom's side. And David doesn't have any other reaction but to know, man, I've just got to get out of town. And so here's the first stop for today, and one of the powerful truths from the story is this, is that bad news is rarely as bad as we believe it is. That bad news is rarely as bad as we believe it is. The Bible tells us that our enemy is a roaring lion. Roars are scary. Usually when we're in the middle of a bad season, the roars scare us, right? When we're in the middle of a bad season and things just don't seem like they can get better and the enemy's prowling and the enemy's roaring, it just seems like there's no end to it. It just gets worse. And every bad day usually involves bad news. But the bad news isn't usually as bad as we believe it. On our worst days, we believe the worst case scenario. I don't know how you're wired, but some of us are wired in the way, man, when one thing happens, we begin to play out how this is going to end. And we end up painting a picture for ourselves that is this doomsday ending of things when, man, God's got a different plan, right? Some of you are like, man, it happened, let's fix it, and let's move on. And others of us are like, oh my gosh, I got this phone call today, which means this is going to happen, and 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 then it's going to end up like this. Like, no, you just got a phone call, right? But bad news isn't usually as bad as we believe that it is. And so often in our lives, when we get this bad news, we begin to believe fears instead of faith. We begin to believe fears instead of instead of facts. I'm sorry. Believe in fears instead of facts. We hear facts and believe fears. The doctor says, hey, just want to let you know that the report came back, you've got stage 4 cancer. That's a fact. But in our mind we hear, man, you have no time left, you're going to die. That's a fact. That's not a fact, that's a fear. God can heal that stage 4 cancer if He wants to. He may not always, but He can heal it. There's plenty of people that have gone back for reports and the doctors are like, I don't know what was here 2 weeks ago, but now it's gone. There's been other reports where maybe that hasn't happened. But so often we hear a fact that we automatically begin to believe a fear. As a parent, you show up at school, the principal says your son is suspended. They did this, and your son is suspended, and they're not allowed on school grounds, and we hear, I'm a failure as a parent. I'm a horrible parent. That's not a fact. That's a fear. You look online to check your bank account, and it says $0. That's a fact. You think, man, I'm going to always be broke. But that's not a fact. That's a fear. And so often in our lives, the bad news isn't always as bad as we believe it to be. We hear facts and begin to believe fears, which leads to the second idea, is that we believe our fears, but we don't believe our faith. That we believe our fears, but we don't believe our faith. A fear tells us that our kids will never grow up to know God. The fear tells us that our kids will never know God. Faith tells us that even though my kids are not in a great place right now, God's plan for their life is greater than the enemy's plan for their life. And so I don't know how or when, but I know they're going to give their lives to Him. Fear tells us that we're always going to be alone. That for those of us that may be single or whatever, that we're always going to be alone, that we've missed our best chance to get married, that we'll never be a mom, we'll never be a dad, that you'll always be the third wheel, that you're not pretty enough, that you're not funny enough. Faith tells us, man, I could have settled for just anybody, but God has the perfect person for me, and when the time is right, He's going to bring that person along. So often in our lives, the fears could go on and on of the things that we hear, but we've got to not believe our fears, but believe our faith. Our faith. The third idea that I'm learning through this story and just in life in general is that we need faith frames in our life. That we need faith frames in our life. That when we get bad news, when we begin to have that worst day ever, that we begin to put things in a faith frame. That we don't allow our fears to take over, that we don't allow facts to take over, we don't allow our minds to run in 8,000 different directions of all the different scenarios that can play itself out, but that we just put things in a faith frame. That when the doctor comes back and says, man, I've got cancer. Like I mentioned to you at the beginning of the message, like my uncle. Like he's a man of faith. My aunt and him are in church every week. And he's been battling this thing for 2 years, I think. But he just continues to remain faithful that he believes God is going to heal him. Like he's just remaining faithful in him. Like he's putting a faith frame around him. Like my aunt is struggling, which I understand as a spouse, like you're being strong, and I'm sure he's fearful on some levels, but my aunt is struggling a lot. My uncle is like, God's got this. He's going to take care of it. And they go back for the report, and they notice something in the scan. He has to go back, and then my aunt puts on Facebook this week and reaches out, hey, will you just continue to pray for Uncle David because the cancer's back. But we just have to put things in a faith frame. You get the report, man, I've got cancer. Our first thought is, man, I'm not going to be able to see my kids grow up. I'm not going to know anything about it. I'm not going to be here. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. This. All these scenarios. But then faith tells us, man, I've got cancer, but by His stripes I'm healed. I lost my job today. My first thought is, man, what am I going to do? Like everything was going well. And I walked into work today and I called into the boss's office, and this has been the worst day ever because I've lost my job. And so my first thought is, man, what am I going to do? Faith frame tells us, man, God's got a better job for you. You just have to work hard to find it. So often we can't just sit back and go, well, God, I lost my job, so I'm just going to sit here and do nothing until you send the perfect situation to me and the perfect job to me. We got to work hard to find it, but eventually God's going to put us where He wants us. And here's my thought, is that our worst day ever doesn't have to be. Our worst day ever doesn't have to be. That we look at this story of David and Absalom. I don't know that there's a worse day that can come than knowing that one of your children wanted to overthrow your throne, and that one of your children wanted to kill you. And David's immediate reaction is, man, I've just got to get out of town. I mean, this is a man after God's own heart. God calls him that. God tells us that. That's how He refers to David. Which tells me and tells you that God and David have this special relationship, that they are very close. I would love for God to refer to me as Kevin is a man after my own heart. But in this moment, when everything gets crazy and everything gets topsy-turvy and everything seems to be falling apart in David's life and the worst case scenario happens, David doesn't turn to God. David doesn't fall on his knees and just begin to pray. He doesn't begin to try to call Absalom in and try to work it out and have some restoration in the relationship. His first reaction is, dude, we got to go. Like, we got to pack up our bags and get out of here or we're going to die. Like, Absalom is going to kill us, so let's just sleep. And all of that's based off of one piece of information which isn't even true. 200 people go to meet with Absalom, not even understanding why they're going, not even knowing why they're going. The report comes back to David that says the entire city is on Absalom's side. How many times has something not true turned your world upside down? Bad news doesn't have to be as bad as we always think that it is. We have to believe our faith more than we believe our fears, which then helps us develop faith frames. Our circumstances don't prove your faith. Our circumstances don't prove our faith. They reveal our faith. Even when it was before I went into full-time ministry, as a brand new Christian trying to figure out what does it look like to follow Jesus. And hearing all of the thoughts and all of the opinions of people that are like, man, like, my whole life is turned upside down right now. Like, I don't understand someone lost a loved one or lost a parent, and they're like, man, I don't know why God would take my mom away, or God would take my dad away, or God would take this person away. Why is He punishing me this way? And they get angry and they get mad and they just, like I said earlier, they just begin to pull away from faith and pull away from church. I can't always give all the answers of why what happens and why there are tragic events and why there are horrible car accidents and youth vans that flip over and spilled coffee and flat tires bouncing across I-4. Like, I don't have all the answers to all of that. If we did, then God wouldn't be God. But I do know this, that our worst days don't have to be. That in our bad days, they can sometimes be God's best moments. I just finished reading through the book of James, and Fred and I are taking the students through the book of James on Wednesday nights at Panera, by the way, at 6:30. If you guys have a student, you want to send it to us, it's awesome. And so we meet at Panera Bread. And so we're going through the book of James together. And many of you guys will be familiar with James 1, but it tells us that there's going to be trials and tribulations and that we should consider it pure joy, right? I don't know any time that I've had a bad day, I'm like, this is awesome, right? Love bad days. Bad days are great. But we're reading through the book of James, and then as I finished up the book of James, I've now moved into 1 Peter, and then I read this week. And typically when we talk about bad days, and we talk about tribulations, and we talk about trouble, James 1 gets quoted a lot, that we should consider it pure joy when we go through trouble. But I want you to hear what Peter, who was kind of Jesus' right-hand man that followed Jesus and had some ups and had some downs and walked on water and sank and called Jesus out and Peter had an up and down journey, faith journey with God, but with Jesus, but he was Jesus' right-hand man. And he writes to us in 1 Peter, and I want to read this to you. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter is writing this book and writing this letter to Christians that have dispersed. Christians that are fleeing for their lives, Christians that are running for their lives as they are they're afraid that they're going to be persecuted, they're afraid that they're going to be arrested, they're afraid that they're going to be killed, and they are dispersed to all these different lands. And Peter writes this letter to them saying, hey, look, your life seems crazy and your life seems turned upside down and all this seems to be happening in your life and all these bad things are going on. But I want you to rejoice in this and know for a little while, if necessary. Like I've read through 1 Peter a lot, but I've always missed the if necessary. That if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials. Like, hey, if you need to go through some things because God is trying to put you through the fire to make you stronger. I mean, we all know how gold is made, but they just continue to put it in the fire until it's in the purest form that they can make it. Some of you feel like you live in the fire, and some of you feel like you go back and forth in the fire quite a bit. But in that time, I believe God is trying to refine us and make us stronger and make us better, so that we know that so that when we go through circumstances, our faith will be revealed. So often we quote James saying, "Hey man, you just consider it pure joy." But I love Peter's explanation of, "Hey, look, if it's necessary, you're going to go through some stuff in your life." But God is just trying to refine you and testing you by the fire, that at the end of the day, let's give praise and glory to Jesus. Our bad days can sometimes be God's best moments. And I don't want you or me to ever be in a situation to where we feel like, man, in a bad season of life, I just need to take a break from church. I'm God, calling a timeout. I don't know why my life is so crazy. I don't know why everything's so turned upside down. I don't know why nothing can seem to go right. I don't know why. I don't know this. I don't know that. I don't know. The church that I was at previously hurt me. The church that I was at before did me wrong. I didn't like this. I didn't like that. God, timeout. Churches aren't perfect. This one's not either. Man, so much when things just seem to get crazy in our lives, I see it way too often that we just start to take a step away. Start to pull. But when our life is crazy and everything is topsy-turvy and everything doesn't seem to be going right, it's more of a time for us to just push in more to God. We're going to see as this story unfolds over the next few weeks, what was David's response to this whole thing. Many of you may be familiar with the story and know exactly how it worked and exactly what David did. And there's many of you that heard this story for the first time today. So if we were a TV show, in about a moment it's going to come up and say, "To be continued." But man, we all walked in this place this morning in different places. Some of us had amazing weeks. Some of us had tough weeks. Some of us are somewhere in between. Some of us feel like we're in the worst season of our life right now. Some of us feel like we're in the best season of our life right now. Some of us aren't even sure what season we're in. We're just here. But our worst day ever doesn't have to be our worst day ever. So I want to ask you to close your eyes and bow your heads with me for just a moment. I'm excited about this series because I believe that it's something that we can all relate to. But there's not one person who sits in here this morning that wouldn't say, man, I've had a worse day ever. There's probably not one of us that hasn't gotten a tragic phone call or a life-changing event or news that's changed our worlds. But man, if we can build our faith in a way that we're not rocked by life's moments. That a worst day ever may just be the worst day ever, but it doesn't have to rock us, and it doesn't have to change the trajectory of our faith. It doesn't have to change how we feel about God, but it just causes us to push more into Him. I mean, in each and every moment of our life, as a believer and as a follower of Jesus, our lives should look more like Him every day. So often they don't. So my prayer this morning, that as the band plays and as we have a time of response, a time of prayer, a time for you to respond however God may be moving and whatever God may be doing in your heart, I want to give you time and space to do that this morning.